So in my last talk, looking at US history for GED social studies, we examined the period from their successful War of Independence against the British up until 1812. This was a period that was dominated by America, the USA becoming a nation of its own, much smaller nation than the USA today, a nation of 13 colonies that became 13 states. And these colonies building a new government for themselves. On the one hand, the colonies recognized that they needed to come together to form one nation, the United States. But on the other hand, these colonies were all very separate, independent organizations that were used to looking after themselves and making decisions for themselves. And in forming this new government, they saw a need to have a strong central government, but also they were worried about a strong central government. It would take power away from the states, and the individuals felt much more part of their states than part of the nation at that stage. They were concerned that a strong central government might restrict their own rights. And so the US Constitution, which is still used today, was brought in with 10 important amendments called the Bill of Rights, which were there to protect the freedoms of the individuals to a large extent. And we get to this period of 1812 where relations with Europe are still quite difficult. France, which had been an ally of the colonists when America became independent, became rather less friendly. Britain, who they'd achieved independence from, were still causing problems. And at the same time, Britain and France in Europe were having an important war that the US was trying very hard to not get too involved in. And this is an America that had grown quite a lot since independence. The economy had grown, but also geographically, America had become a lot bigger. So we have this situation, this political situation in America where there's a lot of arguments still going on between federalists who are believers in strong central government and non-federalists, believers that that really the state should control everything. Country that's become much bigger as it's expanded out of those 13 states, trying very hard not to get too involved in war in Europe. And with an economy that's becoming stronger with the Industrial Revolution, the invention of factories, America trying to make things for themselves rather than to import them is helping this economy. I showed you this slide at the end of the last talk, but this growth of the US, so how the US has grown from the 13 states to, first of all, that light pink area, but then increasing, taking land away from given or sold to them by the French. You can see large areas, the Louisiana Territory, Mississippi Territory, Indiana Territory, and is it Wisconsin Territory? War comes back in 1812, war with Britain. The British Navy begins stopping American boats, forcing American sailors to join the British Navy. There's also a concern that the British are supplying weapons to the native Indians. As the colonists are spreading westwards, I'll just go back to this area again, as they spread westwards, they're coming up against the Native American Indians who don't really want them stealing their lands. And so there's a degree of fighting going on. And the Americans are concerned that the British were selling weapons to the Native American Indians. June 1812, war with Britain starts. The British ships begin blocking US ships bound for France. And then there are battles in the north of the US and in Canada between the British and the Americans. There's no winners and losers from this war. And after a couple of years, there's a treaty. The Treaty of Ghent is signed and war ends. The Monroe Doctrine. This is something which may come up in your GED. There's a president, James Monroe, and what James Monroe is talking about is the US presence in the world, that they don't want European countries colonizing the North and South America. They want Europe out of America. And in return, if Europe stays out of America, America will not interfere in Europe. The Monroe Doctrine. So within America, the colonies are expanding, and America originally is a land for the Native Americans, not for the colonists. There isn't a lot of sympathy for Native Americans in the same way that there wasn't a lot of sympathy for quite a long time for slaves. The Native Americans were felt as enemies of the colonists because they were on the side of Britain in the War of 1812. That these Native Americans were occupying lands that the American settlers very much wanted to own for themselves. Native Americans were not treated well. The settlers would make agreements and then just break them. The settlers felt that Native American Indians, being not of their education, not of their religion, were in some way inferior. That they felt they could take control of America all for themselves, take it from the non-Christian natives. That there was this feeling that some Americans had, which is called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is important for GED. You might be asked about it. And what manifest destiny really meant was that the colonists felt that as good Christian men, that they had it was God's will that they should own America from east to west. George Washington himself believed that you needed to civilize these Indians, as if making them Christian and teaching them English was what civilization was about, which is arguable. But in the end, the Native American Indians owned valuable land, and the settlers wanted that land. And sadly, in the end, for that reason, the Native Americans lost and were driven off it. The way the Native American Indians were driven off the land was pretty shocking. There's a president who in 1830 signed an act called the Indian Removal Act, which gave colonists permission to throw the Indians off these ancestral lands. The Supreme Court actually judged that the native lands should be respected, but they weren't listened to. There's an American tribe called the Choctaw, marched thousands of miles west, many of them in chains, no food, no water, and many thousands died on the march. Other tribes suffered in exactly the same way. And these marches and the paths they follow are today known as the Trail of Tears. Going back to manifest destiny, that this was this belief that the Americans had that they would eventually control the whole American continent from east to west, that it actually belonged to them. This was used not only to justify the treatment of Native Americans, but also their annexing of Texas, and then later California and other western states inside their boundaries that were taken from Mexico. As the USA grew westwards, settlers moved westwards, there was new free land available for them to make their fortune. There's an important trail that runs all the way from Missouri to Oregon. Oregon is in the very northwest of the US, and hundreds of thousands of settlers made that journey in search of a better life. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. And there were a rush of people called the California Gold Rush, who moved to California searching for gold in the hope that that would make them their fortune. And here's a picture. I don't know how clear it is for you to see. A photograph taken in 1849 of Americans in the gold rush looking for gold, panning for gold. The economy in America was expanding. There was an industrial revolution which started in Britain. And as a result of the industrial revolution and the technology that was invented, factories, steam-powered trains came into being and helped the economy enormously. In the northeastern United States, a huge manufacturing industry grew up, making products that they used once upon a time to have to import. Railroads were built that could connect the states to each other. But in the southern states, particularly the southeastern states, life was very much the same. Agriculture, good, strong agriculture, where the manpower was all provided by cheap slave labor, manufacturing or growing products like cotton and tobacco and exporting those products back to Europe. As the US grew, you saw very different patterns of economy and way of life across different parts of the US. Most importantly, in the northeast, you had a manufacturing base. There were factories making products that once upon a time America had to import all of from abroad, but were now making for themselves. Factories that did not require lots of slaves. These were machine-driven manufacturing. Whereas in the South, you had an agricultural base, slaves on plantations. The agriculture was growing products for export, like cotton and tobacco. Very much of an export-driven economy. Whereas in the northeast, this was an economy where you were really replacing imports. That meant that you had very different ideas about how to manage the economy. In the northeast, you wanted to stop imports coming in because that was your competition for your manufactured product. So the idea of tariffs was something that would be supported in the northeast. Whereas in the south, where your economy was driven by an export-driven agricultural economy, tariffs were a bad idea. You were an exporter, tariffs would hurt you. So you didn't want anyone putting tariffs on your products. You also had an economy, you also had agriculture that was not driven by machinery, it was driven by slavery. So slavery was important to you. Whereas for industry in the northeast, slavery was not important, and indeed many were against the idea of slavery. These disagreements between North and South grew. Slavery became the biggest area of disagreement. There were many people, particularly in the North, who thought that slavery was wrong. They were called abolitionists. Following from what was happening in Britain, slavery was banned in 1807, and in the British colonies it was banned in 1838. But in the southern states, they felt they needed their slaves. Their agricultural industry depended on it. The North didn't need slaves at all. There were also many people who didn't like strong governments telling them what they could or could not do. So in this lead up to the Civil War, you first of all saw America growing with the Missouri Compromise, Texas which allowed slavery, getting independence from Mexico. Some of these other Western states that the US won are following the war with Mexico, including California. And then finally, Abraham Lincoln being elected president. Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery. And his arrival as president of the US was enough as far as the southern states were concerned. They seceded from the Union. They broke away from the Union to set up their own government called the Confederate States. Here is the Confederate state flag. So they became their own nation with their own president. And you can see the states that formed, the slave states that formed part of this. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And the result of this, the South breaking away to form its own nation, was the start of the Civil War between these Confederate states and the Union. America was at war with itself. And here you can see that line, which you may see going from the East Coast, going all the way across Texas, was the line between the Confederate States and the Union. Now let's look at some questions that you might get in this area. So question 1, what you've got here is a speech by James Monroe, part of his State of the Union address, and then the question after it. And as soon as I see James Monroe, I'm going to think to myself, Monroe Doctrine. And what was the Monroe Doctrine about? And I'm thinking to myself, before I even start to read this address, the Monroe is all about saying to Europeans, don't interfere in America. Don't you go colonize America. You stay out of America and we'll stay out of Europe. So it's maybe going to be something to do with that, because that's what James Monroe is most famous for talking about. But let's go through this paragraph and see what he says. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise, and in the arrangements by which they may terminate, the occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Now, the language there is language of 200 years ago, which makes it more difficult for you. But if you know a little bit about the history of America around this time, if you've heard of the Monroe Doctrine and what that was about, it helps you with interpreting it, because this question is all about interpreting this passage, this speech. What is the central idea of this excerpt? No other countries can establish colonies in the Americas. Well, that sounds very Monroe Doctrine-like. B, the US plans to begin more colonies in the future. Doesn't say that. C, each of the states in the US is free and independent. Well, it says by the free and independent condition which they have assumed, but it's not really about that. I mean, that's mentioned, but it's not really. That's not really what the central idea is. D, the continents of America can be ruled by European powers. Well, that seems to me the opposite of what James Monroe was on about in the Monroe Doctrine, and it certainly does that there, are not to be considered as subjects for future. So it's saying the opposite of D. So I think we're going to find that the answer is probably A, and let's check it. Well, let's look at the last line. Are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. So no other countries. So I'm going to go for A for question 1. And question 2, this again is another excerpt from President James Monroe's State of the Union address. This is the guy who does not really want the Europeans to get involved in the US, and in return, if they don't, he's not going to get involved in Europe. So here, let me read through it. Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars, which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it and to any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as the legitimate preserve of those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. So again, this is written 200 years ago, so the language is old, is unusual perhaps to us. But we know about James Monroe and his beliefs about Europe not getting involved in America and America not getting involved in Europe in return, part of the Monroe Doctrine. We're now going to look at, from this expert, what the central idea is. Well, he certainly says, the US believes that wars in Europe have lasted too long. And it says, our policy, which was at an early stage of the wars, which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe. So he certainly says that the wars in Europe have lasted too long, but I don't think that's the main idea of his excerpt. B, the US will not interfere with events in European countries. Well, I think that sounds like very likely the right answer, because that's a big part of what Monroe stands for in the Monroe Doctrine. And he also says here that that their policy in regard to Europe, again, I'm going to run line 3, which is not to interfere with the internal concerns of government. So I was talking about the policy in regard to Europe. The very beginning of the piece, you go down to line 3, which is not to interfere. So they won't interfere with events in European countries. So I'm pretty sure it's B, but let's look at C and D just to see. C, the US will submit to the governments of European countries. Well, I would say it's the opposite. They're certainly not going to allow. They're going to allow that, and it certainly doesn't say it. Indeed, the US plans to model its government after the governments in Europe. No, it doesn't say that. So the answer to question 2 is B. Question 3. Questions 3 and 4, excerpts from a letter from a Cherokee Chief John Ross to the Senate and House of Representatives describing the treaty signed by a minority of the tribe, authorizing removal. And let's look at, before we read the piece, let's look at the questions. So, which reflects the opinion of the author? The Cherokee people have been treated unfairly. The Cherokee people accept the treaty and believe it to be fair. The Cherokee people are eager to move to the west. The US government will not help the Cherokee. Let's look at question 3 first. Let's look at the piece. So the instrument in question is not the act of our nation. We are not parties to its covenants. It has not received the sanction of our people. The makers of it sustain no office nor appointment in our nation under the designation of chiefs, headmen, or any other title by which they hold or could acquire authority to assume the reins of government and to make bargain and sale of our rights, our possession, and our common country. So what he's actually saying is this treaty, this instrument by which he means is the treaty, is something that they don't feel that they're party to. It hasn't been sanctioned. It's not received the sanction of our people. The chiefs, the head men, these people were not part of it. So he's saying it that, look, this is a rogue treaty. Now then, let's go back down to line 6, the sentence beginning and and we are constrained solemnly to declare that we cannot but contemplate the enforcement of the stipulation of this instrument on us against our consent as an act of injustice and oppression, which we are well persuaded can never knowingly be countenanced by the government and people of the United States. Nor can we believe it to be the design of these honourable and high-minded individuals who stand at the head of the government to bind a whole nation by the acts of a few unauthorised individuals. And therefore, we, the parties to be affected by the result, appeal with confidence to the justice, the magnanimity, the compassion of your honourable bodies against the enforcement on us of the provisions of a compact in the formation of which we have had no agency. So having said that this is a rogue document, they are then appealing to the good people, to these good judges, to the justice, to say that you please, you cannot enforce this on us because we were not any part of its decision making. So going back to 3, which reflects the opinion of the author, the Cherokee people have been treated unfairly. Well, I think that he's saying that this document was hugely unfair. So A looks very like it probably is the right answer, but let's look at B, C, and D. B, the Cherokee people accepted the treaty and believe it to be fair. Well, I think the author is saying the complete opposite. The Cherokee people are eager to move to the west. That's never mentioned. And question number and part 4, the US government will not help the Cherokee. No, he's appealing to them to do just that. So I think the answer to question 3 is A. And then part 4, then the American lawmakers who enacted the Indian Removal Act most likely believed which of the following? 1, Native Americans can stay in the southeastern states. Well, no, they want them to move. Native Americans will benefit from moving to a new territory. I don't think that they're really very interested in whether they're going to benefit or not. They're interested in taking the territory. The land in the West is better for Native Americans than the land in the Southeast. Again, it's the same as B. I don't think that's something that they're particularly interested in. Or D, the US has more rights to the land in the Southeast than the Native Americans do. I think it's D. I think the Americans feel like, hey, we're going to take this, manifest destiny. If we want it, we'll have it. So I think the answer to question 4 is D. So question 3 is all about interpreting the piece. Question 4 relies on a little bit of knowledge about US history and the way that Americans thought at that time. Next talk, we're going to move on to the Civil War, which has started as a result of this disagreement between way of life in the north, and then particularly the northeast, the manufacturing base, and the south, which is still this agricultural, slave-driven economy. And a lot of the battles are really to do with slavery, a civil war that eventually the Union wins.